All right, sorry for that brief cutoff. So I left off talking about what the wealthy versus what the poorer people wanted to do within these states. So the wealthier merchants on the East Coast wanted to have taxes implemented. They wanted that paper currency to be backed by gold and silver. And they wanted a foreign trade policy to sort of help their money keep value. Whereas the less wealthy people on the frontier wanted more paper money, they wanted lower taxes, and they wanted protection from imports in order, like, increasing taxes on imports to promote domestic production, and then price regulation as well. But there's a clear need for congressional power to make any of these things happen, because the Confederation was ineffective until states would give Congress some of that power. So the 1780s became kind of heated with conversation around this. Congress couldn't conduct foreign affairs, they could not set economic policy, they couldn't settle matters in the West, and people in Congress, a lot of those men were claiming that Americans didn't care about the common good because they weren't willing to give Congress that power. And we'll get back to this in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about women after the Revolutionary War. So during the war, and this happens pretty much in all wars that we're going to talk about, women got increased responsibilities. So they were running farms and running businesses while men were away, learning new skills, and then gaining some confidence and becoming less submissive because they had some of this power. Men, however, did not think that they were fighting the war so that women could get this power. They claimed women were politically incompetent, and most women agreed that women should be in the home. But there were some spaces that had opened. I wanted to point out this poster here. This is called the Woman's Compass. And just take a good look at this, what we have here. So we have this statement at the bottom: enter not into the way of the wicked and go not in the path of evil men. This is a poster promoting women keeping in their place. And so it says here, around this compass, keep within compass, and you shall be sure to avoid many troubles which others endure. So here's the proper woman remaining within this compass, staying in her zone. She's, wearing a fancy outfit, she's in the garden, just being passive. And then around here we have the naughty women, right? So here's a woman here, and I don't think you can really see it very well, but she's reading a book, and you can see that her child is like falling down. So because she's reading, she's a bad mother. We have a woman down here, being seductive on the streets. That clearly is no good. We have a woman who's homeless, selling her wares. And this woman up here is not, keeping her house tidy. She's in disarray. So those are all examples of what women should not be doing. But right here, if you keep within compass, you will be a great woman. So that was one sort of piece of propaganda that was popular at the time because women were gaining these rights. But we also have seduction literature that comes out, which sounds really fun, but really those were books, magazines, newspaper articles, and they all had cautionary tales about being seduced or being coerced into losing their virginity. And of course, the moral of the story, something awful would happen to those women, and it was a bit, tales of morality. So women were seen as the guardians of sexual virtue, and that's not a foreign concept to us, right? We still, hear people say things like, don't dress like that or men won't be able to control themselves, such and such. So that's going on at this time. We also have the concept of Republican motherhood that comes up, and that is like the one way men come up with to harness this newfound power and give different responsibilities to women. And this means that women were responsible for encouraging Republican virtues in their husbands and children. So educated and free-thinking women could raise informed Republican citizens. And so it encouraged education and reading for this purpose. So we start having some new women's colleges pop up. And so in 1850, further down, is when women are finally, my throat, man. There are finally as many literate women as men by 1850 because they're being encouraged to raise Republican families. One power was that after the war, divorce became easier for women. So this was a protection for many women. You know, abusive husbands were rare, but, well, not rare, but that was a rare cause for divorce. But a lot of it was being abandoned or, you know, impotence, like in the Puritan realm. But women still could not sue or be sued. They could not make wills or contracts. They could not buy or sell property. And of course, any wages women earned still just went to the husband. Any property they had at marriage went to the husband. Any rents or any profits went to the husband. So, not many rights. All right, let's talk a bit about Shays Rebellion. This took place in Massachusetts, where things are still pretty chaotic. A lot of people in Massachusetts are pretty close to financial ruin because they have debts, they have mortgages, they don't really have any money, and if they do, it's not worth anything. So in 1786, the lower house of Massachusetts introduced relief measures for farmers to try and help them out a little bit. The upper house defeated it because they were persuaded by creditors. The creditors, of course, enjoyed making money off of poor people. And so the farmers demanded that the upper house be dissolved and that these relief measures go through. And so we had this armed rebellion led by Daniel Shays. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, and a lot of the farmers and men who were marching with him were veterans as well. And so they closed the courts, they marched on the arsenal. Eventually, the militia was called in to put down this revolt in February of 87. Daniel Shays fled to Canada, and this is just a prime example of how this early government was failing the people. You know, we tried to put things in place to try and protect people's rights, but it was not working. So we have this constitutional convention. It takes place in May of 1787 in Philadelphia. Every state sent delegates, except for Rhode Island. And the goal here was to propose a new U.S. Constitution. So they did meet in secret to kind of keep this under wraps. And they did elect Washington as their presiding officer. And the issue here was how to maintain a representative republic while solving different regional and economic problems. So we have a couple plans that pop up. The first one is over on the left here. It's called the Virginia Plan. This is proposed by James Madison. And this proposal consisted of a 3-branch national government. So 2 House legislature, judicial branch, and executive branch. It gave Congress the power to veto state legislation. The lower house would be elected by people. The lower house would be elected by white men. The upper house would be chosen by the lower house. And so this was, you know, thought to be an Enlightenment sort of balance of powers concept. And the smaller states did not like it because representation solely depended on population. So they debated that for quite a while, that plan. Someone else proposed this New Jersey plan, which basically was the Articles of Confederation, except it gave Congress the power to tax and regulate trade. So there was just a 1-house legislature with 1 representative per state. And that was debated for about 4 days, and they decided that was not a good plan. So they continued talking about the Virginia plan, but then Benjamin Franklin's committee came up with a compromise. And the compromise was issued on July 16th. And he suggested an upper house with 2 senators with 6-year terms, a lower house that was population-based, so every 30,000 people would gain 1 representative, and any enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person for this representation. that was a sticky part of this compromise. Of course, the North, where there weren't very many enslaved people, did not want to count enslaved workers from the South in those states' population because it would give them a greater say on legislation, especially when it came to slavery. The South, of course, wanted to count every enslaved person as part of the population so that they could have that representation. So the settlement was 3/5 of one person. Congress did not get that proposed power to veto state laws. We also have a guarantee of the slave trade to endure until at least 1808. And there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. So that was a problem for a lot of people. In September of 87, 39 of the 42 delegates signed the Constitution, and then it needed to be ratified. And this is where we start getting into the discussion of Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. And these were people who were for the Constitution or against the Constitution. And so we needed 9 of the 13 states to ratify, to agree that this Constitution would be in effect. So the Federalists went around promoting it, led by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, John Marshall. These all had money, they had good coordination, they had their own publications, they had some really popular supporters, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and these concepts appealed to people in large cities where there were seaports, where there were creditors, and these are folks who, a strong government would benefit. We start having the Federalist Papers written by the Federalists, promoting Enlightenment ideas. These were essays. They ended up being published in books, pamphlets, newspapers. So their promotions really got around. The Anti-Federalists included people like Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, Mercy Otis Warren. She was the first published woman in the United States, publishing anonymously. And they disapproved of the lack of rights protection. So they wanted those Bill of Rights. And they favored a weaker national government. So they definitely wanted a guarantee of personal rights. So in spring of 88, we have the first 2 states ratify, and those are Maryland and South Carolina. In June, we have New Hampshire, Maryland and South Carolina were not the first. Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. So there are a lot. And then in the spring of 88, we have Maryland and South Carolina. June is when New Hampshire ratifies, and technically at that point it's in effect because 9 have ratified, but they still need the support of New York and Virginia for them to consider that it's successful, for everyone to take it seriously. So Virginia ended up ratifying in June, but they also submitted 20 proposed amendments, and they submitted official support for a Bill of Rights. New York, also in June. North Carolina said no, but then ended up changing their mind in November. And then Rhode Island was the holdout. They did not ratify until May of 1790. Let's pause here because we're leaving off here on part 2, and we'll be back for a part 3 of the lecture.